Mulligan, A Tale of Time Travel and Second Chances by Hank Garner. Read by Ian Garner. Chapter 1. I hate the rain. It reminds me too much of being stuck with nowhere to go on that stupid farm when I was a kid. I can't see a thing. Connor Mulligan adjusted his windshield wipers to the next higher setting and gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles bulged a bright white. He leaned forward, hunched over the wheel, squinting to try to see better. It wasn't much use. The rain was coming down sideways. The radio was blaring and not doing much for his concentration, but his mind was on the meeting. This was going to be his only chance to meet with the financier for special circumstances, and if he was going to save his business, Raleigh was his last hope. He heard his phone go off again, and he glanced over and saw that it was Sarah. She had called at least a dozen times just since he had been in the car. She didn't want him doing business with the loan shark, but Connor wasn't listening to her. She just doesn't understand what it takes to make it in business, and if I'm ever going to have a shot, I just need a boost, he kept telling himself. He had been driving for just over 5 minutes and knew that he would be at Raleigh's office soon. He popped open the briefcase on the seat beside him and started rifling through a stack of papers, looking for the title deed and the other papers the businessman told him to bring. He hated that farm. It was a constant reminder of the life he wanted to leave behind, but Sarah was livid when she learned he was going to use his grandfather's property, and his inheritance, to secure the loan with Raleigh. "That was the only thing that you have left of him," she would say. The phone again. He kept digging for the papers. He glanced back at the road and swore that he saw a person standing right in the center of the road. He blinked and the person was still there. Yes, it was a person. He panicked. He dodged to the right and hit a pothole. Then he overcorrected to try to regain control. The last thing he saw was paper orbiting all around him and the cell phone flying through the air. Then white. A bright, piercing white. Then silence. Lightning flashed and thunder shook the walls. Connor could no longer sleep. Once again, his pillow was soaked through, sweat permeating his hair and pouring in rivulets down his face. He sat bolt upright and clutched his chest, gasping with everything he had for air. His heart felt as if it would race out of control. A strong breeze blew through the small window to the left of his bed and caused the calendar's pages on the wall to flap. August 1929. The familiar panic of disorientation hit him, knowing that somehow he found himself 80 years in the past. Thoughts came in torrents as once again he tried to remember where he was, and who he was for that matter. He started down the mental checklist. His name was Connor Mulligan. He was from... Where was he from? How did he get here? The answers didn't come. He closed his eyes and attempted to pull together the remnants of a dream that had once again startled him awake. The bright lights, the crashing cacophony of sounds, the acrid smell that burned his nostrils, the sobs, the screams. Try as he might to grab at the dangling threads of a quickly evaporating dream, it wasn't working. The visions were gone, and all he had was the unsettling feeling of knowing that something awful had happened, but he wasn't able to piece it together. Now he wondered how close it was to sunrise. With it storming, he couldn't be sure, so he took his pants from the foot of the bed and decided to get up. No sense in pretending to sleep when it's obviously not going to happen. One more night of sleep wasted, he mumbled. He crossed the room to the little table that served as a makeshift desk. He pulled out the chair and sat down. The sky was dark, but the occasional flash of lightning allowed him to see across the expanse of the rows of cotton. He rubbed his face and attempted again to remember anything from before last week, but no matter how hard he tried, the memories just would not come. He looked around at the finished-out loft of the barn on the Wiggins farm, but he wasn't even sure who the Wiggins were. He remembered that he had wandered by a week ago and talked the owners into letting him come on as a farmhand. He was embarrassed by his lack of memory and made up a story about his past and how he had come to be in the county. He told them he was traveling back from visiting family, and since the economy had started falling apart, he was taking any job he could until he could work his way back to Kentucky. Mr. Wiggins was cordial enough and told him he could stay if he earned his keep. Mrs. Wiggins had dressed the bed in fresh linens and filled a small, ornate lamp with oil. "This here will be your room. We eat breakfast at sunrise. Be there, you'll have to wait until lunch," she had told him. She seemed to be nice enough, but terse. All business. He was thankful for a place to stay, but he really wished he could sort this out. It had been a long week already. He leaned back in the wooden chair and stared into the clouds. The clouds started to break to the west, as storms tend to do along the river, and after watching a while, he saw the gradual illumination of the sky in the east. He had no idea how long he had sat there, attempting to pull on anything that might trigger a memory, but as usual, nothing came. He went down to the house to join the Wiggins family for breakfast. It would be a long day in the fields after a restless night. Mrs. Wiggins was busying herself with setting the table when Connor rapped on the door and let himself in. Mr. Wiggins and Benjamin, their 11-year-old son, were at the table eating their bacon and biscuits. Mrs. Wiggins faced the stove as she prepared eggs. Connor picked up the mug that was set at his spot at the table. He poured a cup. Everyone was quiet. He noticed an almost tangible tension in the air. He felt like a guitar string wound tight and ready to snap against the pressure. "That was some rough weather this morning, wasn't it?" Connor said. Mr. Wiggins nodded his agreement. Benjamin was silent. Mrs. Wiggins brought over the skillet with eggs and with one quick motion scooped out a helping on each of the men's plates, her head down the whole time. Connor looked around, wondering what he might have been missing. He made a mental note and decided this was something that he didn't need to involve himself with. Breakfast was finished without hesitation, and the men piled their plates in the sink. Mr. Wiggins and Benjamin headed out the door, and Connor followed behind. Just before walking out, he heard a voice call his name. It was faint as a whisper at first, then stronger, yet ethereal. "Connor! Connor! Connor!" He stopped and turned around, but he couldn't place where the voice was coming from. He closed his eyes and tried to clear his head. He glanced back at Mrs. Wiggins. She was standing at the sink with her head down, her shoulders moving in a way that looked to him as if she was crying. He started to say something, but he realized that she didn't call out his name. Instead, he pulled on his hat and left. The hot August sun didn't take long to burn off the clouds, and just like every other day, it felt like the Mississippi Delta in summer. Connor walked across the porch and toward the field that was waiting for him. The day would be a long one, and last night's sleeplessness would not help. He could feel the steam rising from the puddles of water left over from the storms. He walked to the barn where Mr. Wiggins and Benjamin were sorting through the burlap sacks that they would use to harvest the cotton. Mr. Wiggins offered him a bag, and without a word, the three set to their day's work. The work was hard, and the weather could be brutal if you weren't used to it. The Mississippi humidity is something that must be eased into, as many immigrants from the north had learned. It isn't that so much hotter than other places, but the humidity makes breathing a chore. You get the impression from the wet air that you were enveloped in a blanket of hot water. Connor tried hard to concentrate on his work, but his mind was consumed with images from the dream, and he was reminded of the panic he felt as he woke up. He hunched over, steeling himself, and got to work. The morning was long, and as the sun rose high in the haze-filled sky, they broke for lunch. Mr. Wiggins motioned to him to join them. They dropped their pick bags at the barn and walked to the house. The men could smell vegetables through the screen door that opened into the kitchen. They hung their hats on the pegboard by the door and pulled out chairs. A glass pitcher of fresh lemonade was on the table, and they passed it around and filled their glasses, thankful for the respite from the sweltering heat. "Daddy, do you think it's going to rain this evening?" Benjamin was the first to speak up. Mr. Wiggins looked up from his plate of peas and ham sandwich and stared out the window. He didn't answer Benjamin, but the look on his face told the tale. Rain would not be a welcome sight on this farm. Lunch passed without fanfare. Connor had only been there for a week, but he had observed enough to know that Mr. Wiggins wasn't a man of many words. And if he was a betting man, and to be honest he didn't know if he was or not, he would have bet there was more to Mr. Wiggins' mood than he had let on. Mrs. Wiggins left the room after getting the men settled at the table and their food served. Connor watched her as she made her way into the bedroom without a word and shut the door. Mr. Wiggins looked up and saw Connor's face. The look was enough to tell Connor to leave it alone. So he did. After lunch, the men sat on the back porch for a few minutes to let their food settle. The sun was high and blazing hot. Everyone knew what had to be done, but no one had the fortitude to get up just yet. Connor had a nagging feeling in his gut. but his own feelings of self-doubt kept him from speaking up. He thought for a few minutes about the dreams he had been having, but the thing that bothered him the most was his lack of memory. He just couldn't for the life of him place who he was, which terrified him the more he thought about it. Was he an escaped convict? Had he been in some sort of accident? He didn't know. "Mr. Mulligan, it's time to get back at it," Mr. Wiggin said. Connor looked up at the sun, and he knew it would be even hotter than the morning. He stole a glance back to the front of the house and wondered where Mrs. Wiggins was and what had her upset. He decided it wasn't his business. He headed back to the field.